And quickly some upcoming NCRP events. Tomorrow we'll be releasing a report on the Oregon Community Foundation, assessing how this largest foundation in Oregon can be more responsive to underserved communities across the state and their advocacy efforts. We'll also be doing presentations at the Sojourner Summit in DC, the Sustainable Agricultural and Food Systems Funders Conference in Louisville, and at Netroots Nation in July. So if you're any of those sessions, please let us know. And tomorrow there will be the first of 3 national teleconferences for funders in response to the Orlando shooting, hosted by Funders for LGBTQ Issues. That's from 11 a.m. to noon Eastern. I'm sure Ryan Lee can give more detail later on if folks have further questions, but we encourage you to make time for that in your calendar as well. We're really excited for our presenters today. Ryan Lee Dahlstrom, who is a consultant for the Funders for LGBTQ Issues Trans Funding Working Group, will be moderating the majority of the discussion today. We're also happy to have with us Nakisha Lewis, who is the Senior Strategist for Safety at the MISS Foundation for Women, Rai Young, the Executive Director of Third Wave Fund, and Kris Hayashi, the Executive Director of the Transgender Law Center. We'll go more into depth about the expertise they bring to this topic later on and hear straight from them. So we're excited for this conversation. Throughout today, we encourage with you to engage with us on social media. So if you're online as well, we are too. You can tweet at NCRP, at LGBT Funders, and at any of our panelists. We'll have our Twitter handles for NCRP and Funders for LGBTQ Issues displayed on the slides throughout the presentation. And the Twitter handles for our presenters will also be displayed throughout the presentation as well. So we encourage you to engage there so we can keep this conversation going today. To give you a brief overview of today, we're going to have a few quick polling questions for you to see who's on. Ryan Lee will give some context about why this issue is important every day, but particularly now. We'll also hear from our speakers, the work they do, and how they're contributing to efforts to better support transgender communities across the country. Then we'll have some discussion and Q&A with you, the audience. So we'll ask you to submit your questions, and we'll have our panelists respond as best they can in the time we have. And then we'll talk from there about steps we can all take, whether you're a funder, whether you're a nonprofit, whether you're just a layperson who wants to be supportive, how you can contribute to this effort. So to make sure everyone is awake, we're going to do a quick poll. I'm going to start in just a moment. So you should see a poll pop up. It says, who's on the call? Are you a funder interested in this topic? Are you a nonprofit? Are you a lay community member? And when we say funder, you could be a donor, you could be a foundation, however you identify, let us know who's here. A few more moments. So the folks who responded, looks like 48% are with a funder, 43% with a nonprofit, and 9% with identified as a community member. So a big spread on this webinar, and we're happy to have all of you here. One more question for you. This one says, how often does your organization consider transgender communities in the course of its work? So always, very often, sometimes, rarely, or never. few more seconds. Results are in. 30% say very often, 30% also say sometimes, 15% say always, 20% say rarely, and 6% say never. So again, quite the spread of responses here. Thank you for sharing. And with that, I am going to turn things over to Ryan Lee.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much, Ben. And hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here today. And thank you, Ben, for hosting and inviting the conversation, and also to all of the participants. It's really exciting to see how many people were interested in this conversation. And also to the amazing speakers. I've had the honor of working with each of the folks on the call in different ways, and really appreciate Kris, Nakisha, and Rai for joining the conversation today. So I wanted to start off by just sharing briefly, starting us off on some shared language, so we're all on the same page in terms of when we're talking about trans, what we mean by that. So in terms of trans or transgender, and some of this may not be new to folks on the call, but just want to make sure folks are kind of in the same place. So we're really talking about an umbrella term that refers to anybody whose gender identity or expression is different from the sex that they were assigned at birth. So that includes folks who might identify as transsexual, genderqueer, gender nonconforming. Some folks are using language like non-binary, trans man, trans woman. There's a lot more terms that I could use. I'm not going to get into all of them, but it's really an umbrella term. For cisgender, which may be a term that some folks are less familiar with, cisgender really refers to a person whose gender identity matches the sex that they were assigned at birth. So if you were assigned female at birth and you identify as a woman, you're a cisgender woman. If you are a person who was assigned female at birth and now identifies as a man, you would be considered a trans man. Or a trans woman would be someone who was assigned male at birth and now identifies as a woman or somewhere on a more feminine spectrum. We could get into a whole discussion about femininity and masculinity. That's a whole other webinar, but just to say, just so we're generally understanding what we're talking about when we're saying cisgender man or woman or trans man or trans woman. Gender identity is something that we all have, whether you're trans or you're cisgender. It's really your own sense of self and how you identify your gender. For some folks, that changes over time. And then also gender expression is, again, something that whether you're trans or you're cisgender, everybody has a gender expression. So really how you express your gender, how you wear your clothing, accessories, how you present yourself in the world. And with gender expression, that's something that can really change day to day for folks over time. Gender expression really is something that we all experience and really is about an expression of self. So, and then just on the tip of pronouns, I just want to say, again, in a lot of like social justice organizations or other kinds of organizations, I think there's more and more folks trying to make sure that we don't assume pronouns. Whether you're trans or you're cisgender, we want to make sure that we're creating spaces where everyone, we know what everybody's preferred or rather pronoun is, and so we know how to refer to somebody as him or her, she or her, he or him, she or her, they or them. Or some folks don't choose to not use a pronoun and may just want to go by their name. So might be something to consider in your organization is when you're having a meeting or going around with a new group of people or in a job interview, you know, to ask people what their pronoun is so we don't assume. And so everybody is naming that. I've seen some funder spaces doing that recently at the Funders Concerned About AIDS convening recently on HIV and trans issues. And it was really great to have the question asked of all trans and cis people to identify their pronoun. If you're interested more in talking about this in terms of terms and practices at your organization, Funders for LGBTQ Issues does a lot of trainings, and I'd be happy to talk with you after the webinar if you have questions or want to think more about how to bring practices like this into your organization. So obviously, I would be remiss not to mention in terms of the context, and Ben, I might need help. I'm not, the slides are not moving for me, so if you could move to the next slide. You know, I would be remiss not to mention Orlando today as part of the conversation in the current context that we're in. And so I want to just take a minute. You know, this webinar was scheduled before, you know, the Orlando tragedy happened. I just want to acknowledge and recognize the Latino, Latinx folks whose lives were lost, and all of the communities and families that were impacted by this tragedy. And really to say that, you know, we have a lot of work to do in terms of what we're seeing in, you know, communities of color and queer and trans communities, and particularly queer and trans communities of color in terms of violence. You know, this is one of the larger scale, you know, targeted violence, but we're seeing just so much intense violence impacting trans and queer communities and communities of color right now. And so I wanted to just give a little context for Orlando. So Orlando is based in Orange County, Florida, and I found out that 50% of the hate crimes reported in Orange County, Florida, were based on sexual orientation. We don't have data around gender identity, but often, you know, as we know, perceived sexual orientation has, you know, direct connection and correlation to, you know, gender identity and gender expression. So, you know, within this context of a high level of violence nationally, and particularly in Orange County, Florida, you know, we want to center this conversation around, you know, what are the issues impacting trans communities, and what can the philanthropic community do around addressing this and being more responsive and talking with one another and having ongoing conversation about how we can be better equipped to really address, you know, things after they happen, but hopefully, you know, more in a way of organizing communities, supporting the leadership of folks on the ground who are really trying to work on addressing the significant level of violence communities are facing. And, you know, I think a lot of people might look at trans issues right now and see, you know, the celebrities and, you know, a lot more conversation in public discourse and media and say, wow, we're so much better off, things are so much better. And I think for those of us working on the ground and those of us are trans and working in community, you know, we know that that's actually not the case. You know, we're seeing increased violence, we're seeing, you know, disproportionate violence as we're getting more of this visibility. We're also seeing continued discrimination, trans communities facing a lot of poverty, homelessness, and particularly trans communities of color, and particularly trans women of color and Black trans women. We'll hear more from Kris and others on the call later, but we're also obviously, as we know, seeing a lot of these policies come through, you know, the the bathroom bills and the anti-trans legislation, these religious exemption laws. So we're definitely seeing a very targeted focus and an organized focus on the right to really, you know, attack trans communities. We're seeing a lot of immigration, detention, and deportation, particularly impacting trans women of color. We're continuing to see a lot of incarceration of Black and brown communities, and including trans people. And so really, you know, there's a lot to be done in terms of addressing safety, just basic safety and wellness and well-being of trans communities. There's just so many access barriers around healthcare and employment, housing. So, you know, trans issues cut across every issue and every kind of intersecting form of oppression. You know, many trans communities are just trying to meet basic needs and daily survival. And so today's conversation, we really want to center the lives and experiences of trans people, of people of color, and of those who are most impacted by structural racism, who are living at the intersections of these many forms of oppression. So that's kind of the context and sort of the framing for how we want to have this conversation today. And I think, you know, it'll be really uplifting to hear what some of the folks on the ground are doing and what some of the funders who are on the call are doing in terms of addressing a lot of these issues. But before we get into that and hear from our amazing panelists, Ben, if you could put me to the next slide. I want to talk a little bit about the landscape of philanthropy and the current funding around trans issues. The next slide, please. So, you know, between 2010 and 2014, we've seen a kind of steady increase. Particularly in 2012, we saw $5.3 million going to trans-specific work. And in 2013, we saw, you know, a $3 million increase. And then between 2013 and 2014, we saw a $4.6 million increase. So, you know, we're on the rise, which is good, but in the grand scheme of philanthropy at large, it's still a pretty small amount of money that's going to trans communities. Part of the reason we've seen these increases has been around the increase in health funding, particularly HIV and AIDS funders who've been really making some significant increases in their trans portfolios. We've seen an increase in funding around trans visibility. We've also seen an increase in community-led grant-making projects like the Trans Justice Funding Project and others who are really, from the community trying to raise more resources to put back into the community. At the end of this year, we anticipate a $15 million increase. $15 million by the end of this year, largely because a lot of leading funders who've been supporting trans issues are making increased pledges. So we have the Global Trans Initiative that Arcus and Novo recently launched, MAC AIDS Fund, Elton John AIDS Foundation, VEEV are all some organizations, foundation who have started to increase some of their trans grant making. I also want to just put into context LGBTQ funding overall in 2014 was at $153 million. So that's compared to 12.9, as you see on this slide, that was specific to trans funding. So, what that means in terms of broader philanthropy, for every $100 that all of philanthropy is giving out in grants, less than 1 cent is devoted to trans communities, which is really, really sad and really, just this sort of call to action, I think, to really think about right now in this moment, what can we do to raise that number and really get more money out the door to trans communities. I'll take the next slide. So here you'll see the top 20 list of funders who are supporting trans issues. This is actually quite a diverse set of funders, many of whom, are more diverse actually than LGBT funding at Broad. So, we have HIV/AIDS funders on this list, health funders, women's funds, LGBT funds as well as non-LGBT funds. We also see a mix of public and private foundations. We see groups like Trans Justice Funding Project who are actually raising all of those dollars from individuals and are number 18 on this list at $140,000. What I want to also bring out in this slide is that we also need a lot more funders at the table who are funding trans work. There's still relatively few funders who are supporting trans issues, and really only a handful that are supporting at a significant level. So you see a pretty big drop-off from the $300,000 range, at kind of number 10 to 12, and then after that the numbers decrease quite a bit. So awarding a $300,000 to trans issues makes a funder one of the top 10 funders of trans issues. And then I think, a hopeful piece of this is that, there's a great entry point to do trans funding, right? Like we see a very intersectional, diverse set of funders who are prioritizing funding trans issues. And so we really see that trans issues are very intersectional and cut across many different issue areas. I'll go to the next slide. So speaking of issue areas, this is kind of where the breakdown of trans funding by issue is. So we've seen a pretty steady increase in civil rights. We've seen a pretty significant increase in health and well-being, as well as communities, families, and visibility. What we have not seen a very big increase around is groups that are specifically addressing violence and transphobia. And as we've talked about, this is one of, a very significant issue facing trans communities. So that's something, an area where we would love to see more support is for groups that are working on addressing violence and transphobia. I'll go to the next slide. So this is a population focus. This is basically, of all funding that was trans-specific, this is a secondary population focus. So of all trans funding here, the majority of trans funding was, 40% was going to people of color, 12% to children and youth, and 10% to trans women, which is great given, some of the other stuff I shared in terms of issues, communities of color, young people, trans women being particularly impacted by issues that trans communities are facing. But we also see other things like immigrants, incarcerated or formerly incarcerated people, survivors of violence not receiving as many funds, or homeless, low income and homeless people. So this is, a real opportunity, whether, someone is a criminal justice funder, education, immigration, you can really see the opportunity to really help grow this population focus, to really reach some of the different communities within the trans community that are needing the resources. And I also just want to say that this tracking is dictated by how funders are reporting through 990. So if you haven't reported your funding to us at funders, or you feel like you may not be captured on this list or the previous, please do contact me or someone else at funders, and we'd love to make sure that your funding that you're doing is represented in this tracking. I'll take the next slide. So, I think we have a pretty great diverse range of folks on the call representing many different parts of the region, which is really, the U.S., which is really great. And what I want to pull out here is that the majority of funding is still kind of concentrated around the East Coast, and an increase recently in the South, thanks to a lot of specific funding initiatives, including out in the South as the Project of Funders for LGBTQ Issues and others who've been partnering to really look at increasing resources to the South, as well as specifically LGBT and trans resources to the South. What we don't see much of an increase and not very many resources going to is, the mountain regions, the Midwest. So that's definitely an area we would love to see more resources supporting. There's a lot of really great grassroots work happening in those areas, but they're definitely under-resourced. Next slide, please. So we have the trans funding here by organization type. So you'll see that the majority of folks here on this list are the kinds of groups that are receiving funding are advocacy groups and service providers, which makes a lot of sense given issues that trans communities are facing. What we don't see a lot around is arts and culture and community groups. And I think I really want to uplift the community groups because a lot of community groups, particularly, smaller grassroots groups, are doing kind of everything and often are very under-resourced, may not have a lot of staffing or infrastructure. But in many communities, and as someone who grew up in the Midwest, I saw often that some of the groups that were social groups or community groups were kind of doing everything. They were referring people to social services. They were doing organizing and speaking out at the Capitol. They were, doing a lot of different kinds of work, but very much from like a community level, grassroots, and or social level. So again, that's another area where we would love to see more support to really uplift trans leadership and grassroots organizing. Next slide. And then lastly, so this is trans funding by organization focus, and what we can, 1% unspecified, sorry, that was changed from earlier. I wanted to make sure that was noted. But what this kind of indicates is that still the majority of funding going to trans work is not supporting organizations that are either trans-led or trans-specific. So this is another area where we would love to see more resources supporting the leadership of trans people and organizations led by trans people. So that's a good cue to kind of hear from some of our folks on the ground who are doing that work. So I'm going to pause here, and I guess I want to just also say that we could get really into the data, and I'm happy to have another conversation with folks on the call, but I really want to honor the time of the panelists and have a rich discussion with the panelists. If during some questions arise around the stats, or you want to follow up with me after the call, I'm happy to talk with you more if you have specific questions around anything that I presented, as well as stuff around, training opportunities. So I'm really thrilled to bring together the conversation with this amazing, brilliant panel of people who I look to as colleagues, but also as mentors and as people who I'm just really honored to be in this movement with. So thank each of you for being here. I want to start off by introducing Rai Young, who's the Executive Director of Third Wave Fund. Rai is the first Executive Director carrying Third Wave Foundation's work forward at its new Proteus Fund home. He began his career as an abortion fund hotline intern at Third Wave Foundation. Rai served in various program roles at Third Wave and dedicated himself to developing systems for impact measurement and grant making while crafting programs that met the needs of Third Wave's grassroots community-based organizations. Rai strives towards a gender justice movement that is strong and interconnected across social justice movements. He was a Grace Paley Organizing Fellow with Jews for Racial and Economic Justice and serves on the Board of Directors of Funders for LGBTQ Issues and the New York Abortion Access Fund. So Rai, thank you so much for being with us today, and I would love for you to just kind of tell us a little bit more about Third Wave, your mission, your strategies, and the work that you're doing.
Awesome. Thanks for that introduction, and thanks NCRP and Funders for LGBTQ Issues for putting this together. The Third Wave Fund is a gender justice fund that supports youth-led activism. So this means that we use a social justice approach to fund work that is led by women, trans, and queer youth. We don't fund in one movement or one issue, but rather we fund around leadership, and specifically the leadership of young women of color, queer and trans youth of color, and low-income youth. And we really take their lead to support what their communities consider to be most vital issues. So that's meant that we've supported reproductive justice work, sex worker organizing, anti-violence work, immigrant justice, and so on. Our grant making consists of a rapid response fund that's called the Mobilized Power Fund, as well as a long-term 6-year grant making and capacity building program called the Grow Power Fund. And both of these funds give resources to youth-led gender justice work and strive to meet activists where they're at and in a way that meets their specific needs and the needs of emerging and grassroots organizations. I'd say Third Wave is known for taking strategic risks on funding new organizations and new models of organizing, and for designing our grant-making process around the needs of young activists who are balancing many other priorities and who typically have understaffed organizations and who've lacked access to foundation funding, as is typical of, I'd say, the vast majority of trans-led organizations. So for instance, our Mobilized Power Fund, which is the rapid response funding vehicle, has taken a bunch of different steps to make sure that our communities can readily access this funding when crises hit or when there's a strategic opportunity to affect change. So some of those steps have included funding groups who are not a 501c3, as well as accepting grant proposals over the phone, by video, or with a simple bullet point one-pager. And I think an important aspect of accessibility is, which sometimes I think underestimated, is the makeup of our own leadership. So, applying for funding can be a really jolting or intimidating process. So being a community fund that's led by and for young women of color, queer, and trans youth is an important part of creating a welcoming environment for us, and for inviting emerging grant seekers who are often getting their first national grant from Third Wave. One highlight I'll share is a new initiative we launched to address the incredible number of rapid response proposals we got around these so-called bathroom bills. The initiative is called the Flush Transphobia Fund, and it was announced last month. I want to give a big shout out to our partners, MAC AIDS Fund, Ms. Foundation, who's on this call today, Groundswell Fund, who's in the audience today, the Elton John AIDS Foundation, and Transforming Movement Funds. The Flush Transphobia Fund is providing at least $100,000 in grants over the next 12 months to trans and gender nonconforming organizations who are bringing their much-needed leadership into the advocacy against bathroom bills. Third Wave serves as an important philanthropic pipeline for groups who are leading local movement building efforts that activate young people, people of color, women, queer, and trans folks, and who, no matter how well they do their local work, lack a way to grow and receive funding for the work that they're doing. And I'd just say lastly that Third Wave is a political home for people who often feel left out of philanthropy. And one of the things we do is nurture the development of new philanthropic leaders through activist grant making processes, who we hire on the staff and who serves on our board. I myself, started as an intern, which you heard in my bio, but so did our past director, and about 30% of our board were previously interns, which is something that we're really proud of. So that's just, a snapshot of our work, and I'm excited to have a discussion with the other panelists in a few moments.
Great, thank you so much, Rai. So next up we have Kris Hayashi from the Trans Law Center. So Kris is the Executive Director at the Transgender Law Center. The Transgender Law Center works to change law, policy, and attitudes so that all people can live safely, authentically, and free from discrimination, regardless of their gender identity or expression. Kris has been active in social, racial, and economic justice organizing for over 20 years. Kris served as the Executive Director, Co-Director of the Audre Lorde Project, a lesbian, gay, bisexual, two-spirit, trans, and gender nonconforming people of color organizing center based in New York City for 10 years. Previously, he served as a trainer organizer at Western State Center in Portland, Oregon, and as Executive Director of Youth United for Community Action, a youth organizing group in California, led by young people of color organizing for social and environmental justice. Thank you so much, Kris, for being here, and I would love to hear more from you about the work you're doing at TLC.
Great. Thanks so much for having me here today. I just want to start by talking a bit more about the Transgender Law Center. So the Transgender Law Center is the largest organization in the world advancing the rights of trans and gender nonconforming people through litigation, policy advocacy, public education, and movement building. We were founded over 10 years ago as a project at the National Center for Lesbian Rights. TLC started as a California-focused organization with just a few staff, and we've now grown to a national organization with 24 staff. Our main office is here in Oakland, California, and just this past year, we opened up our regional office in Atlanta, Georgia, in partnership with Southerners on New Ground, which is a LGBT Southern regional organization. Just to give a quick sense of our work, so we work using multiple strategies. We've won groundbreaking litigation cases, including the Mia Macy decision, which in 2012 made clear that transgender people are protected from employment discrimination under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. We have three primary goals for our work. One is to get law and policies in place to protect the rights of trans and gender nonconforming people where they do not exist. The second is to make sure that once we have those laws and policies in place, they are actually implemented, that people on the ground actually feel the reality of those laws and policies in their daily lives. And the third is to increase public understanding and consciousness about trans and gender nonconforming communities, who we are, the issues we face, and to build a broad movement across the country in support of the rights of trans and gender nonconforming people. So again, our work is across many strategies, and over the years we've launched some innovative programming that really center the experience, leadership, and analysis of trans and gender nonconforming leaders, particularly from some of the most vulnerable parts of our communities, including communities of color, trans women of color, trans and gender nonconforming youth. So for example, we've launched a project in partnership with the GSA Network, which is a national queer and trans youth organization called Truth. This project really focuses on supporting the leadership of trans and gender nonconforming young people to tell their stories, to advocate for their rights, and to organize in their communities. We also launched a project called Positively Trans, which really centers the experience of trans and gender nonconforming people living with HIV, primarily trans women of color, to really impact and influence national HIV/AIDS strategy to make sure that trans people are included and part of the goals of that work. We also, this past year, launched a project here in California called Transform California, which is the first ever statewide public education campaign around trans and gender nonconforming people. We've launched in collaboration with Equality California. It's called Transform California. We're also very excited that there are a number of different states looking at launching similar projects. So I'll just close really quickly by saying I want to just emphasize what Ryan said in the beginning, that while we've had a number of legal and policy wins over the years, while there's been this incredible increase in visibility over the past few years, the reality is that the majority of trans and gender nonconforming people are struggling to survive on a daily basis. The reality is that we are 4 times as likely to live in poverty. 90% of transgender people have experienced employment discrimination. The lifetime risk of HIV for a Black transgender woman is 1 in 2. Because of the rapid rates of discrimination that our communities face, a large number of trans and gender nonconforming people end up within the prison system where people face horrific abuse and violence. 78% of trans and gender nonconforming youth experience harassment in schools to the point where 1/6 are actually pushed out of school and not able to graduate. And we know that our communities continue to face incredibly high rates of violence and murder. We've lost over a dozen transgender people, majority of whom are transgender women of color, to murder in this country this year alone.
Thank you, Kris. So I'm going to pause after our next speaker if people have any questions for the speakers, but first I'd love to hear from Nakisha with Ms. Foundation for Women. Thank you so much for being with us, Nakisha. Nakisha is the Senior Strategist for Safety at the Ms. Foundation for Women, where she oversees program design and grant making for the safety portfolio. She's a thought leader in the field of philanthropy and specializes in developing grant-making strategies that address racial, gender, and educational inequities. Nakisha has worked extensively with individual donors and foundations to foster grant-making that seeks to support, empower, and strengthen marginalized communities, including her most recent work as the co-creator of the Philanthropic Action for Racial Justice, an effort to organize Black philanthropic practitioners around a shared vision for racial justice and investment in Black communities that centers the needs and experiences of Black women, youth, and LGBTQ people. Nakisha is a longtime advocate for racial and gender equity who has spent more than a decade supporting youth and grassroots organizing across movements. She's worked on a range of justice issues from education and fair housing to welfare and workers' rights, and is co-founder of the #SheWoke Committee, the catalyst for the Congressional Caucus on Black Women and Girls. She's a writer, speaker, and founding organizer of Black Lives Matter New York City. Nakisha serves on the board of New York Blacks in Philanthropy and is an ABFE, Association for Black Foundation Executives, Connecting Leaders Fellows. She's published in several periodicals and nonprofit journals, including the Chronicle of Philanthropy, Huffington Post, and NBC News. She's also appeared on CNN, Huffington Post Live, RTV, and BK Media Live. Nakisha lives and works in Brooklyn, New York. Welcome, Nakisha. Thank you so much, and I'd love to hear more about the work you're doing at Ms. Foundation for Women.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ryan Lee, for having me, and thank you to Funders for LGBTQ Issues and our partners for pulling together this crucial conversation. And I think about this moment that we're in, and so thank you for opening us up, providing the context for us around really what's at stake for trans people in America, and particularly our larger LGBTQ community, as I think we're all reeling right now and thinking about how we support each other and can be more community-oriented. That particularly has me thinking about why and how we do our work here at the Ms. Foundation, right, is looking to actually address the issues of the people that are most impacted and most oppressed in this country. For over 40 years, the Ms. Foundation has invested in women and girls, believing that the oppression of women and girls makes it so that the rest of us as a people cannot fully thrive. And so here at in the safety program, which I oversee, we have been focused for about the last 6 years or so at addressing issues of violence, primarily domestic violence and family violence, through the particular lens of ending child sexual assault. So when I came onto the foundation about a year ago, a little bit over a year ago, we wanted to really think about how we could be more intersectional in our grant making and actually broaden the lens through which we thought about safety, and really think about what are the various ways and most pressing ways that women, girls, and gender nonconforming people are actually seeing breaches to safe living or to safe living conditions. And so after embarking upon several conversations and a bit of a mini tour around the country and bringing with me the work that I've been doing in community for several decades now, I really landed at the place that we had to make sure that we did our work utilizing what I've been framing as a Black queer feminist lens, right? Prior to coming to the foundation, I'm not sure that I am someone who necessarily identified as being a feminist, because I didn't see feminism as a place where people like me, right, as a Black lesbian from poor Boston with immigrant parents, could actually find freedom, right, to find liberation. I didn't believe that the feminist fight was my fight. And then I thought about all the other folks who were living on the margins with me, including transgender women. And I definitely didn't think that this work was for us. And so I thought, how could we, right, really think about safety at the intersection, a safety that is rooted in intersectionality, right? I think the core meaning that Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw gave to us when she really tried to center those who were most oppressed, right? Those living at the margins of the margins, if you will. I think that meant that we had to ensure that whatever program we designed had to be able to center trans women of color, and it looks like what we're moving forward with is something that it centers Black trans women in our work. And so I'm really happy to talk later about actually what that looks like. and ensuring that, I think the point that you brought out at the top of this conversation, Ryan Lee, is that just the basic safety, right, and the basic well-being of communities of color, and particularly trans people of color, is just something that has gone under-addressed, as we saw through the statistics that you walked us through, and most definitely under-addressed in philanthropy. And so we look to shift the tides of justice for trans people, for gender nonconforming people, and for women and girls, particularly women and girls of color in this country.
Thank you so much, Nakisha. That was a great way to bring us together, moving us to the next part of the conversation. So before we move to more discussion, I think Ben had wanted to do a quick social media prompt, but before that, I want to honor the questions that have come through so far. So give me 1 second while I navigate this. So I think we had one question about where do the info on investments on trans issues come from. So that's all done by data tracking that the Funders for LGBTQ Issues does. So like I said, it's through 990, and also people self-reporting where their grant making is going and to what issue areas and what communities. So I'm not the data geek on that, although I really love and appreciate our data folks. So if you want to connect more on some of that specifics, I can definitely after. And then I had another question. Are there organizations, so I think this is to you, Rai, potentially, are there any organizations that help people 35 and older that is similar to Third Wave Fund? I'm finding people over 35 need more help, especially in smaller towns or rural areas. I'm from New Mexico.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're the only funder of trans work who's really specifically oriented around youth. I think if you looked at the Trans Justice Funding Project, they support, you know, a huge range of trans-led work. Estrella Foundation is a good place to look, and I'd say Funders for LGBTQ Issues in general is a good place to find information about who those particular funders might be. I'd look at the top 20 list and sort of peer into what their priorities are.
And I would just add, I know the Trans Justice Funding Project recently did kind of a listening, learning tour through the Midwest, and I believe also was in New Mexico. So maybe connect up with Gabriel Foster, who's their director, and you might be able to also kind of hear more, connect more with them in terms of some of the work they're doing and some of the connections they've been making specifically in your state. The next question I have is, do HIV funders count as non-LGBTQ funders? Yes. When I say LGBTQ, it's more specifically like Estrella or ARCIS. That's specifically like what they do is LGBTQ funding. So yes, HIV would be outside of non-LGBT funders, would be considered. The next question, to follow up on Nakisha's point around feminism and intersectionality, how do we bridge the experiences of trans women of color with those in mainstream women's rights funding donor circles? What are your tips?
Am I unmuted?
Yes, you are. We can hear you.
Okay, great. Awesome. I mean, I think that's exactly the project in which we're engaged, right? The social project, if you will. And through the work that I seek to do here at the MIDS Foundation is to not separate out our trans women of color grantees from our grantees who may identify as otherwise, right? And so for me, under the banner of women's rights or girls' rights, however we define that or call that work, we are going to and are including in our grant-making portfolios organizations that are led by trans women, that are led by gender nonconforming people, and we're being more explicit and ensuring that we're going into those places, right? So I'm happy to talk more or to even have more conversation offline about what that actually looks like, but it actually means that we have to shift the way that we have been doing philanthropy. It means that my grant making means that I can't just go off of what I normally see, right? So excuse me, the organizations that mainstream funders are supporting, right? Understanding that trans women have long gone off of the radar of traditional philanthropy. I take a lot of my cues and a lot of my learning from the Trans Justice Funding Project spend a lot of time in conversation with folks like Gabriel Foster and others who are leading in the field and ensuring that we bring, I think, the leadership to the forefront of trans people of color and trans women of color in particular. So I think there's a lot that we can do there, but it definitely means that we've got to be in a learning mode. It means that we've got to be willing to go where we haven't gone before and be really bold and risk-taking in our philanthropic practices.
Great, thank you, Nakisha. So the next question before we move on, I have a question around, do you have any recommendations on resources for diversity training for staff working with youth? I'm going to assume this is for a foundation training, but maybe, I'm not sure, but let's say maybe Rye or Kris have ideas on this, or Nakisha as well.
I'm not positive off the top of my head. Third Wave will do some trainings with foundations on trans inclusion, on a youth lens and a gender lens more broadly, but I'm not sure of youth-specific, gender-specific training centers. I wish I did. Kris, do you happen to know, does GSA Network do any of that type of work?
Yeah, I would.
Focus in the school.
Yeah, I would say that the GSA, it would be good to check out the GSA Network website. They may have resources. I'm not sure if they do those exact type of trainings, but I'm sure they'll have some resources on it.
Yeah, I'll also add that a lot of youth organizing entities do some amazing training. So they're not necessarily youth service organizations and aren't started to do training, but I think about Girls for Gender Equity, which is based in New York, in Brooklyn, New York. They do, they started to do a lot more trainings across the country, as well as folks like BYP 100 and I'm sorry, I've got the acronym, FCYO, which is coming to mind, who work with youth serving organizations that are much more on the organizing front and are predominantly or who center LGBTQ youth.
And I believe, Nakisha, funders concerned about, or something with youth organizing, I forget what the C stands for, but is that who you're referring to?
Funders, yes, it's the Funders Collaborative for Youth Organizing.
Collaborative.
ED there is Eric Braxton.
Thank you. Great question. So I'd love to continue the conversation. We have some great questions for the panelists, but you know, if there's other resources you're looking for after this call, I'm sure NCRP and Funders for LGBTQ issues would be happy to connect you further. So please feel free to reach out. So we have a question. Ben, do you want to lead us on this?
Sure. Thank you, Ryan Lee, and thank you so much to all our panelists who have shared their thoughts so far. I just want to remind everyone that we are active on social media. Kelly King Jackson has really brought up the point about how trans people are pushed out of school and incarcerated at higher rates. The Simmons Foundation has also been really active. So we'll check in before the end of the webinar to see what else folks are saying, but we encourage you to be active online as well.
Thank you. Great. So I have a few questions that I want to ask the panelists, and you all can decide among yourselves who wants to start. But the first question I have for you, to kind of build off some of the things you were sharing in terms of the work you're doing. So when you're thinking about trans communities and social movements, social justice movements, and the leadership of trans people across the country, where are places that where do you see places of hope, possibility, and particularly where do you see growing momentum right now in this political moment? I'm going to just, actually I'm going to have Nakisha start just to kind of change up the order from what we started from the beginning.
Thanks, I'm happy to start. So one of the places I definitely think about is Detroit, right? One, as I think it was Kris who laid out for us, we've seen or heard about at least 12 murders of trans people, majority of whom have been trans women of color this year alone. So in the first 6 months of 2016. A good portion of those, they don't have the percentage, have been instances of violence against trans women of color, mostly Black and Latina trans women in the greater Detroit area. Detroit is also home to some intense organizing and a seat of ridiculous, I think, racial injustice, right? We've heard about the water crises and economic crises plaguing communities of color in Detroit. And so when we talk about being able to support organizing at the intersections, it's really beautiful to see the organizing that has been sparked and led by trans women of color. I think about the Trans Sisters of Color Project, which I believe is now housed at, I think, Michigan Equality or Equality for Michigan, something like that. Don't quote me, but the organization is Trans Sisters of Color, and they have just been doing amazing work to fight or to really stand up against the violence that has been, I think, surging throughout their community. I also think about leaders like Elle Hearns, who comes out of Cleveland, Ohio, or somewhere in Ohio. I don't want to make Cleveland her hometown. But I think about the work that she did in the wake of the murder of Tamir Rice. And I think the mishandling of that murder case by prosecutor Tim McGinty. Right, so again, organizing at the intersection, so what we would typically see as organizing against state-sanctioned violence, here we have a young Black trans woman leading the fight alongside Black Lives Matter, Get Equal, and some other organizations to bring about this, I think, momentary victory for the larger racial justice movement, the anti-police brutality movement. So it's been really beautiful, as I really land the answer to the question, to see the leadership of trans women of color, particularly Black trans women, in this intense anti-Black racist moment that has sort of swept across our country, coupled with the ongoing LGBTQ violence. So I think it's important for us to look at them, look at where their leadership is, and I think there's a lot of promise if we continue to invest in Black trans women and other trans women of color as leaders on the front lines of all of our social justice fights.
Great, thank you, Nakisha. Rye or Kris, do you have things you want to add?
Yeah, I can jump in as well. Definitely want to echo what Nakisha has talked about, but I also want to just say a little bit more, I think, about kind of this current movement moment we're in. In 2016, I think it's been referred to that we just faced this onslaught of anti-trans legislation. And when I'm talking about the anti-trans legislation, I'm talking about laws that basically make it illegal for trans and gender nonconforming people to use the bathroom, sometimes levying bounties or fines if we use the bathroom that we need to use. And also want to be clear that the anti-trans legislation that we've seen isn't just about targeting trans people. It's really about criminalizing and targeting anyone who does not look stereotypically like what a man or a woman looks like, right? So these are laws that are really about criminalizing trans people, criminalizing gender nonconforming people simply for using the bathroom. And we've just seen an onslaught of this legislation across the country. We've seen cities trying to pass the legislation. We've seen transgender people be a part of presidential debates with anti-trans, transphobic ads. We've just seen this onslaught of anti-trans campaigning across the country in a way that we really have not seen before. And it's very, very clear that trans and gender nonconforming people have become a wedge that raising up the specter of fear of quote unquote men and women's dresses going into bathrooms to harm people, which never happens, is a tool that the right wing has found extraordinarily effective in overturning rights, not just for transgender people, but for all people. And what I also just want to be really clear about is that with the anti-trans legislation, it's very evident that the most vulnerable members of our community, so people of color, youth, trans women of color, are the folks who will bear the brunt of these laws, of these anti-trans campaigns. And I just want to also add up that while many of these bills did not move or pass, the reality for transgender people on the ground across the country because of these anti-trans campaigns is that people are facing increased scrutiny, increased bathroom policing, that for a community that was already vulnerable, already struggling to survive, the conditions on the ground are so much worse. But what we've also seen in this period is that trans and gender nonconforming leaders across the country have been speaking out, have been mobilizing, have been fighting back against this legislation, often with very little resources, with very little infrastructure, because as folks have spoken to earlier in this call, there has been many, many decades of lack of investment in trans movement, in trans leaders, in trans movement infrastructure.
Thank you, Kris. Brian, do you want to add to the conversation?
Yeah, thank you. I think, you know, in spite of the incredible barriers that Kris, you did a great job really giving a sense of just what exactly the trans communities are up against. I'm most inspired by the fact that trans leadership is quite literally at work in every single social justice movement right now. I think that's often been true. I don't know that there's been quite as much space allowed for trans communities as there is in this current day. And I think that this inclusion brings really critical perspectives and analysis that serves to strengthen all social justice work. I think trans leaders are within all movements asking if trans communities aren't being seen in your work, what else isn't being seen? Is gender being noticed? Is sexuality being noticed? Is there a strong class analysis? Is there a strong race analysis? And I think they're really driving home all kinds of social justice work around housing, economic development, ed, healthcare, whatever you can think of. I think these questions are bringing important shifts and focus to work that had existed for so long without a gender lens, without a prominent gender lens. I think we're seeing this intersectional approach in leadership of work that Nakisha highlighted that we've also funded as a grant maker, work throughout the Black Lives Matter campaign, school to prison pipeline work, immigration, just to name a few examples where trans leadership has really been critical to not just you know, spaces of inclusion, but actually moving the conversation to a better place. I think when people heard trans issues in the past, they'd often think about the act of physical transitioning. I think that right now, because of the work of TLC, Sylvia Rivera Law Project, Queer and Documented Immigrant Project, and so on, I think people are recognizing that trans issues are also poverty, are about detention, deportation, and incarceration, employment rights, and that they really map onto a broad progressive agenda that will only be strengthened by more trans inclusion. And I think that it's, you know, I think that the trans movement largely has been articulating shifts that are really just about creating a just society in its fullest sense that can hold the full range of our diverse bodies. And I think that is incredibly inspiring.
Sorry, I know, I realized I was on mute. Sorry about that. Sorry for losing you for a minute. But yeah, thank you for bringing that together, Ryan, for Nakisha and Kris, your thoughts as well. So building off what you all have just shared, I'd love to just kind of hear from your different positions in terms of the work that you're doing. You know, what do you think is needed right now to fully address this moment of backlash, of, you know, increased violence, you know, of particularly like the impact on trans women of color and violence that we're seeing? What are some things that you think, either through the work you're doing or other ways to really address what's happening?
Yeah, I can jump in unless Kris or Rye want to get us started. All right. So one of the things that I wanted to pause and recognize is the fact that I'm acutely aware that I'm sitting here as a cisgender woman, albeit a member of the queer community, but a cisgender woman speaking about the issues, primarily from my space, impacting trans women and trans women of color, right? And to my knowledge, there's not another trans woman of color on this who can speak about this work, especially from the seat of a philanthropic change agent. And so I think that while there is great organizing on the ground work that needs to happen, there is the work that we ought to do in philanthropy to move money to the organizing, to the communities that are most impacted. There is also the work that we need to do to ensure that there is leadership within philanthropy, and I think that this is a cross-sector for those of you who are also in nonprofit organizations that seek to support transgender communities, is ensuring that there are trans people in leadership, right? That there are gender nonconforming people in leadership, that they get to be part of the conversation and taking us to where we need to go as we sit around these tables, believing ourselves to be architects of solutions. At the very least, in our case, we are the architects of philanthropic strategy, right? And so I really want to make sure that that our trans sisters, our trans brothers, our siblings are able to be part of that work. So I think that that's definitely one thing that we need to do, and I just wanted to lift that up. And I think the other piece is, akin to something that I raised earlier, is really look at our grant-making strategies wherever they're situated within the foundation, right? So whether it's in a gender portfolio or whether we're looking at a racial justice portfolio, whatever it is, right, there's a way for us to look and see, are we engaging with trans communities? Are we bringing their issues to the fore? If what your organization does before you actually determine your investments for the year, for the quarter, or what have you, is bring speakers in, right? Is you bring folks in to sit with your board. If that's something that you do, included in those knowledge sessions, are there trans people of color, right? Are there trans people, period? Are there trans women? We want to always be asking ourselves these questions, right? Who is missing? Who is being left out? I think that when we start to do that audit as organizations, we'll start to see that we're missing trans people. That means that if we are an institution that is committed to dismantling barriers to success for people of color, or if we are an organization committed to ending violence against women, and we aren't engaging trans communities, then we haven't gone far enough to do our work in a fully inclusive manner.
Thank you, Nakisha. That's really right on. Thank you for raising that. Rai or Kris, before we take some questions, is there anything you want to pull out in terms of your work and what you think is really needed right now in this moment?
Yeah,
go ahead.
Yeah, I can just jump in and say, I mean, I think I'll just say that the reality of the trans movement is that trans leaders, gender nonconforming leaders, have been organizing, have been building community spaces, have been advocating our rights for decades and decades across the country. People are organizing out of their cars, out of their homes, with very little resources, as folks saw in the call earlier today. There has been, so the need for increased support for developing movement infrastructure, leadership infrastructure. But I guess I just want to be really clear that it's not new, that this crisis that as a trans movement we are in is not a new crisis, that there are ways that it has become incredibly heightened because of the onslaught of anti-trans legislation, the onslaught of anti-trans campaigns that we have seen, and then with what we saw most recently in Orlando with the incredible violence that is specifically targeting Black and brown LGBT people, we are also seeing just this incredible increase in hate, violence, and hate threats against the community. And this is not new crisis, but it is definitely a new heightened level to that crisis. And so there is just such need to resource trans organizations, to resource trans leaders on the ground in all these states who have been organizing for such a long time without resource and support. One quick story I'll tell is that we were working with some folks in South Dakota who were facing an anti-trans bill in that state, and the governor said that he had actually never met a trans person. And those trans leaders were going to go to meet with the governor that next day and were sharing with us that they didn't even have gas money to make it to that meeting with the governor. Like, that is the reality of the state that most trans organizations across the country are in. So there's just such an incredible need for resourcing, for capacity building, for support for trans leadership in this moment.
Thank you, Kris. Thanks for sharing that story and raising that up. Ryan, do you want to add anything before we pause and take questions?
Yeah, I would like to just say something about this. For me, the lessons of specifically HB2 as it relates to philanthropy is that the places that have the worst bills pop up against trans communities in the last year are also the states that received the least funding for trans work over the last few years. So, for example, in North Carolina, there was only one grant in all of 2014, that's the latest data, that went to trans organizations, and that was from a local funder. In Mississippi, where we saw a copycat bill of HB2 that was even arguably worse, there was not one single grant for trans work, whether it was trans-led or otherwise, in the whole state during that whole year, as well as 2013. So I think there's a really important lesson there that needs to transcend the boom and the bust cycle of rapid response funding. And as much as I'm loving that strategy and we're utilizing it as an important tool to reach communities in need when they most need it, we are also doing it alongside of a 6-year grant-making initiative that prioritizes trans and gender nonconforming communities of color to develop long-term infrastructure that can create proactive strategies that develop leaders for the long haul who are trans. And I think that this emphasis on funding work that's led by the communities that they serve is really important, especially when you look at the way that misunderstanding and sort of distance from the community is what is allowing the right to leverage this hatred against a huge amount of people. So the more we can have advocates who actually demystify the trans experience and who can actually speak to what it's like to be trans, I think that advocacy work will be all the better for it. And I just also want to emphasize that HB2 is not just about bathrooms. It's about using hatred of trans communities for a far and wide-reaching conservative agenda. Not only does it discriminate broadly against LGBTQ communities, but it also goes so far as to blockade any campaigns that would fight to raise the minimum wage. There are so many things in HB2 that are utilizing the heightened anger and fear of trans people to get away with things that have historically been unwinnable or that would be unpopular for the conservative agenda in this election year. And then the last thing I just want to say is that that there's there's a double-edged sword to bathroom bills that harm trans communities obviously and explicitly, but that there's this other way that women are affected by the bill in the way that it really manipulates the serious issue of violence against women while doing nothing for that issue. And I really do think that this is, motivated by electoral politics and falls within a pattern of the right manipulating violence against women for all kinds of conservative agendas, like invading Iraq, like racial segregation, all kinds of things that we can point to. And I just want to make sure that we don't miss that important part of the picture.
Thanks, Rai. So I really appreciate each of your analysis and assessment of what's going on and what's needed. And I'd love to hear, we have 5 more minutes, so I'd love to just hear if there are other questions that folks, given this, really smart framework that folks have raised, if there's questions that now you have for the panelists. I do have one question around the presentation. It will be emailed to folks after the call, so if you're wanting to get these slides, they'll be shared later, as well as the recording.
Ryan Lee, I can highlight a question that was sent to me via the chat feature. Basically, the question was from Mary Beth, who works at a university with a law school that she says has a remarkable history of educating the current leaders of LGBT rights movements. And she said, how might how might we prepare the next generation of leaders and raise awareness of trans issues in partnership with current trans funders? How much of a funding priority can leadership development and education be in contrast to issues of safety and survival? Are community-based groups interested in working more closely with universities? So a lot of questions in there, but this question around education, leadership, universities seems like to be the main themes she's raising here.
Great, thanks, Ben. One of the panelists want to respond? I'm not sure how much folks' work intersects with universities on this call or not, so I'm not sure if people have thoughts on that. Are you all with me? Can you hear me?
Hey, I'm here. I'm not quite sure I know an answer.
Okay, that's okay. Kris or Nakisha, do you have anything to share?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really have, I'm not super clear actually on the question, but I will say that there's been a really important role that universities and research have played in kind of trans movement work, and I do think that that's going to be important as we move forward. And the question around youth, you know, I think that there's incredible organizing happening led by trans and gender nonconforming youth all across the country, and centering that in any kind of work with other youth organizations will be critical.
Yeah, sorry, I don't have anything particular to add.
Okay. Are there any other questions that we have from the group before we close? Oh, I think I got another question in. Next question is there a national, state level, this person's saying specifically California, SoCal, or LA County, data on economic issues, employment, financial capability, housing of the trans community? If not, can you please point me to a website that might have this data?
Well, this is Kris. I can just say, you know, the National Center for Transgender Equality has the most kind of comprehensive survey to date on trans and GNC communities, and very, very soon, I'm not sure when this year, will be coming out with their updated report, which is super exciting, and I know they have a ton of data in that, which may include some of the answer to your question. And then here in California, I would need to check. I mean, I know that there's been San Francisco specific studies, but I don't know if there's been statewide specific ones.
There also may be some data from the Williams Institute. I'm not sure. I know they've been trying to do better of making sure gender is tracked, and they're tracking gender-related stuff in their survey, so that might be another place to look. There's also, it's pretty outdated, but there used to be an organization called Careers for Economic Justice out of New York, and I know they had some different stuff that they had put out. So you might look to some of their stuff that's a little dated, but might have other links to other economic justice work that connects to queer and trans work. So we're kind of at time. I had hoped that the speakers could do a quick close, but I think the last question you all were kind of giving a little bit of your insight about what could be done or what could be addressed. I don't want to go over time too much, but if there's just like a one-sentence thing that I know that's a tough list, but if there's just one last thing you want to share in one sentence, and then we'll close. Is that okay, Ben, time-wise? I know people might have to drop off, but.
Yeah, no, that's fine. That's fine.
Okay. So just one thing, maybe one step. So one step funders can take today to be more supportive of trans communities. I recognize we have nonprofits on the line as well, but this was really an effort to really talk about philanthropy especially. So if there's one thing you have to say for funders to think about around supporting trans communities, that even if you said it before, this is your time to say it again in the close.
This is Kris. I can start out. Yeah. You know, I'll just say that I have been speaking on the funder panels at this point for about 12 years. And the reality is that my message when asked this question has not actually changed. To please fund us, to fund trans-led, trans-focused organizations. That need is critical. It always has been, and that there has been growth in that, but it is nowhere near the resources and funding that we need to meet the incredible violence and murder and harassment and discrimination that our community continues to face on an ongoing basis.
Thank you, Kris. Brian?
Sure. Just to make it quick, I'd say that when it comes to funding trans work, I would really recommend kind of going broad but also going deep. So by broad, I mean coming up with an actual tool that you can use to apply a trans lens as well as a broader gender lens to all of your work, a really quick go-to guide. And then by deep, I mean look at just one issue priority and pay, hopefully, an advisory group of trans folks to really go deep on what it would look like to fully understand all of the dimensions of that issue area from the perspective of a diverse group of trans communities who are affected by that issue.
Thank you, Rai. Nakisha?
Yeah, I would say fund trans women of color, not organizations led by trans women of color or projects led by trans women of color, not an ally or someone else who's claiming to do the work on their behalf. Fund them. I'd also say that make sure that you engage trans women and trans women of color in particular in the design and implementation of your work. Don't do it for them, and then ask them to be okay with it. And then lastly, consider yourself a trans funder, right? You can be today if you decide to, just by funding trans communities and engaging trans communities. So that means come out of your silos, come out of your box, and decide today that you will be a trans funder and do it.
What a great way to leave us. Thank you all. I really appreciate your thinking, your analysis, just your leadership, Kris, Nakisha, and Rai. So thank you so much. And Ben, thanks for hosting. And, if there's other questions, please don't hesitate to contact me or funders or NCRP if you're looking for more ways to connect with some of the things that the speakers raised, or if you're looking for more resources for your institution. Thank you again to everybody, and we really appreciate everybody being on the call today.
Yeah, that's right. I just want to echo that. Thanks to Ryan Lee, to Kris, to Nakisha, to Rai. We were so happy to have this conversation with you all today, and it doesn't end here. And I'll just say, people have asked, we'll be sending out the slides and the recording in a few days. It includes these resources that you see here. And I would just echo what Ryan Lee said. Consider us a resource. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are people doing this work, and you can do it too, no matter who you are or where you're based. Thanks everyone for being here, and thanks to our panelists for their leadership.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.